In this tutorial, we will look at different ways to finalize and up the quality of rendered garments. In order to ease the simulation of the garments, the avatar is given a default thickness of 3 mm. Because of this thickness, the overall volume of the avatar is slightly larger than what it is actually simulating. So after all the garments have been placed, you can bring the thickness down. Right-click on the avatar to activate the pop-up menu and select Avatar Properties, then Skin Offset, and change the value to 0. Turn the Simulate button on, and you can see that now the garments lie much closer to the avatar's body. The same thing applies to the thickness of the garments. They are set at a default value of 3 mm. So we are going to change the thickness to 1 mm, but when we simulate, you can see that because we adjusted the thickness, parts of the avatar peek through the clothing. This is something we can solve by lowering the particle distance, which is ultimately what determines the quality of the overall rendering. Select all the garments and then change the particle distance under the property editor to 5. Sync and then simulate to render the garment. Now the problematic areas have all disappeared and the quality of the rendering has improved significantly. Next, let's take a look at rendering seams. To see the changes in rendering, we are going to first change the rendering style to monochrome. Then under the sub-menu of the Show Garment icon, we are going to uncheck the Show Seam Lines option, and as we do, you can see that the seam lines on the garment all disappear. The seam lines option we just deactivated is actually something that can only be seen in Clo3D and will not be rendered if the file is exported into the Show player or another 3D program. Therefore, to properly render seams, we have to go through a couple of steps. We need to first select any seamline pair in the 2D pattern window by using the Edit Seamline tool. Then under the Object Browser, the selected seam is listed. Use the scroll bar to locate the very first seam at the top of the list, select it, then holding down the Shift key, select the very last seam listed. This will select all the seamline pairs in the current file. Next, under the Property Editor, change the fold angle to a value between 200 and 240 degrees. This angle is of course applied slightly differently depending on the kind of fabric that is being rendered, but in general, fabrics like silk and jersey do not fold as well as stiffer fabrics like denim or cotton poplins. So keep this in mind when adjusting the fold angles. Turn the Simulate button on, and you can see that now the seam lines have some definition. You can use the same technique to express top stitching, but instead of adjusting the angle for seamline pairs, you adjust the fold angle of internal lines. For example, for this t-shirt, we can use the internal polygon tool to draw a top stitch line, and then change the fold angle to a value between 220 and 240 degrees in the Property Editor. Sync and then simulate, and the lines fold in just a little bit to give the effect of a top stitch.